This lesson is about the Jews of Kastoria. Kastoria is a very nice town with a lake in northwest Greece. It's less known than Yanina because it's much farther away. They have a big diaspora in New York, but in general the community is less known. In the map you have, Albania is to the upper left, and Kastoria is in the middle section in the north. Above it is Macedonia. So it was closer to Macedonia, so the community had a lot of connections to Monastir. Again, there was a beautiful lake, and that's part of the history of the city. You have a view of the old town. On the top, on the upper right-hand side, is where the Jewish quarter was. It's on the top of a hill. The Jews arrived in Kastoria in the time of the Emperor Justinian's rule. In the 11th century, the local Jewish community was headed by Rabbi Tobias ben Eliezer, the author of Lekach Tov. In the 11th century, many Jewish refugees settled in the city, in particular Jews from Hungary who escaped the pillage of the Crusaders. Noteworthy was the 14th century Chacham Leon Judah ben Moses Mosconi, who wrote on the Torah commentary of Rabbi Ibn Ezra, and there was a paitan, we'll call him a religious liturgical minstrel, David ben Eliezer, who composed the Machzor Kastoria, the Kastoria prayer book. When the Ottomans conquered the city in 1385, the Jewish community was known as a Greek-speaking Romaniot culture. After the conquest of Constantinople, which became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, in 1453, most of the Jews of Kastoria were transferred to the capital and formed a congregation in the Balat quarter. In the 16th century, the Sephardic refugees from Spain and Apulia, southern Italy, settled in Kastoria. Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Castilian became the dominant Jewish language. In the 16th century, there were also Jews from Sicily. So you had usually, just like in Arta, you had the first synagogues were of Jews from Apulia and Sicily, and then also Sephardic Jews. But within a generation, the community became Sephardic, and all the Italian Jewish customs and prayer rite was put aside. From the 16th century onward, the Jewish merchants were active in the fur trade and eventually gained a worldwide reputation in this field. There are also Jewish peddlers, artisans, and tax collectors. In the mid-17th century, there was an active Sabbatian following, including Rabbi Shmaya ben Moses Mayo, who in the end remained loyal to Jewish law. He once was in a ceremony, like a mystical ceremony to anticipate or speed up the coming of the Messiah, where he rolled in the snow, and with a group of his Kabbalists, they immersed themselves in the lake. So they did a lot of crazy things, but in the end they conformed to normative Jewish law. They didn't go with Shabtai Tzvi as the false Messiah, and unlike many of his followers, they didn't convert to Islam. So Nathan of Gaza, the main disciple of the false Messiah Shabtai Tzvi, spent time in Kastoria and wrote his book Sefer HaBriah there. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman ruler Ali Pasha imposed heavy taxes on the Jews of Kastoria. During that time, the head of the Jewish community was Rabbi Moshe Itzik Halevi, the author of Maaseh Moshe, a book on about Halakha and the legends of the Talmud. There was also a synagogue, of course, and the local Jews continued to speak Judeo-Spanish. In 1828, the synagogue that was built in the mid-18th century was destroyed, and in 1830, in its place, an Aragon synagogue was donated by the famous local philanthropist Isaac Bechor Moses Russo, nicknamed Senor Shaki. Later in his life, he moved to Jerusalem, and all over the world, the Jews from Kastoria pay homage to his memory. They have an annual date for his yard site for the commemoration of his death. A Jewish school was established in 1873. In the earlier stage, it wasn't an Alliance Israelite Universelle, it was more like a Talmud Torah. The Jewish community suffered from blood libels by the Greek Orthodox in 1879 and 1908. The Judeo-Spanish dialect of Kastoria also had a special character, and it would be different than the dialect spoken in Salonika, or even different than that spoken in Monastir. It hasn't been very analyzed. Most of the community, of course, was killed in the Holocaust, so there wasn't anyone to ask hardly after the war. And then in the 30s, there were researchers who interviewed people in the Balkans, but they never went to Kastoria to get examples of Judeo-Spanish. Beginning with the first decade of the 20th century, with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, economic decline, and threat of Jewish conscription, emigration from Kastoria to New York ensued. From 1900 to 1917, Jews from Kastoria also migrated to Turkey, to France, and Germany. The community operated a Jewish school with teachers from Eretz Israel for the purpose of teaching Hebrew. There was also a Jewish club where Hebrew was taught, and the Jews of Kastoria professionally were active in leather tanning and tax collection, as well as the fur industry, and especially make machines to make fur coats, etc., etc. And then there were fur merchants. There were also artisans and peddlers, as I mentioned before. At the eve of World War II, there were 900 Jews in Kastoria. The city was annexed to Greece in 1912-1913, after the Balkan Wars, and Jews from Monastir who were surrounded by the Bulgarians in World War I, they migrated to Kastoria after the war. In 1928, the community numbered 900. There were general censuses in Greece in 1928. That's how we know that number. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the youth of the community had an active Judeo-Spanish theater group. In the 1930s, graduates of the local AGG, Agudat Jeune Juive, in other words, the Association of Young Youth, founded by the Jewish school principal Jacques Ashkenazi, formed the nucleus of the Garin, the agricultural settlement group that in 1937 established the Moshav in Eretz Israel, Sur Moshe. It was a Choma v'Migdal settlement. It was a clandestine settlement set up at night to create a fact with a wall and a tower, and this was in order to evade the British prohibition about forming new Jewish settlements. Here you have a picture of Jews in Kastoria before the war, in formal dress. Of course, modern formal dress, Western formal dress. There's a picture in the 30s of Jews walking around that's a little more traditional. Jews in the fur trade, something we usually don't hear in terms of Sfaradim. In the early 1900s, groups of Jewish immigrants working in the fur business made their way to North America, mostly settling in New York and Montreal. When those that settled in Montreal discovered they couldn't get the skilled workers they needed, they simply contacted the most skilled they could find. They went to Kastoria and recruited workers. Even to this day, many of those involved in the fur trade in Montreal are of Greek origin, Greek Christian, not the Jews though, mostly from Kastoria. Today, the furriers of Kastoria are known worldwide for their quality of work. In addition to the Montreal community, large populations exist in New York and Frankfurt, Germany. Those are Greek Orthodox. The Jews are in New York. The Jewish population of Kastoria stood at 1,500 Jews at the beginning of the 20th century, and then maybe half the people left, and then the rest that stayed were killed mostly in the Holocaust. Here you have a picture of a traditional Jewish couple from Kastorian Ottoman dress. Here's a picture before the Holocaust of two little kids in the Jewish quarter. And then I think this is like a gathering, a picnic on Lag Boma or something out in the periphery before the war, of course. In 1941, the German army helped fascist Italy, which attacked Greece in October 1940, and the town of Kastoria was bombed from the air. In May 1941, the Germans completed the occupation of Greece, and the Jews of Kastoria were forced to do forced labor. At the end of 1941, following an agreement between Germany and Italy, Kastoria, as all of Western Macedonia, passed into Italian hands. The Italian rule was very civil and reinstated the Jews in their former status, and they lived in comparative security. But in 1943, Italy surrendered to to the Allies, and Germany broke the alliance with Italy, and then the Germans returned to Kastoria as the occupational rulers. At the beginning, racial laws were not applied against the Jews, but they were ordered to pay ransom of money. Later on, they were forced to wear the yellow star and hand over gold that they possessed to the Germans. It was a relatively quick occupation, so by the beginning of 44, the Nuremberg laws were set into enforcement. In March 1944, this is on the evening of Passover, or Pesach, the Jewish quarter of Kastoria was encircled by the Germans. On the 10th and 11th of April 1944, they were transported to their deaths at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Only a few Jews of Kastoria survived the war. There were a group of Jews from Monastir, from Macedonia, that escaped to Kastoria, because then it was the Italian occupation. But then when the Germans took over, they also were trapped and deported to Auschwitz. Here is a statue commemorating the deportation, and there's also a more detailed marble tablet about the deportation. There's a local Holocaust memorial that has been defaced, unfortunately. There is a film made by two second or third generation Castorians in America called Trezoros, like our Sephardic treasures, the lost Jews of Kastoria. Here's a picture outside the gate of the synagogue. And in 1948, there were only 35 Jews in Kastoria. Their numbers dwindled to a mere 22 in 1965, and today there are no Jews left in Kastoria.